how agreement quietly disappears. It didn't end with an argument. It didn't fracture in public. Agreement didn't collapse. It thinned, slowly enough that most people never noticed it was leaving. To understand why this matters, we need to look at what really holds markets together. Not rules, not data. Agreement, the shared understanding of how others will behave when uncertainty appears. When that agreement is intact, markets feel smooth. When it weakens, everything feels heavier. For a long time, agreement felt automatic. Participants trusted that others would respond in familiar ways. Dips would be bought. Volatility would be absorbed. No one needed to coordinate explicitly because behavior was predictable. Agreement lived in habit. The first reveal begins with subtle divergence. Faced with the same information, participants began reacting differently. Some acted immediately. Others waited. A few stepped aside entirely. No reaction was wrong, but the lack of uniform response mattered. The market stopped moving as one. The second reveal appeared in timing. Reactions that once aligned now arrived out of sequence. Support appeared late. Resistance formed early. Moves extended further than expected, not because pressure increased, but because agreement weakened. The invisible glue was loosening. The third reveal emerged when experienced participants sensed something unsettling. The market still functioned, but it no longer felt coordinated. Liquidity was present, yet conditional. Confidence existed, but it wasn't shared. Agreement hadn't vanished, but it was no longer universal. That was the moment agreement quietly disappeared, not through conflict, not through fear, but through fragmentation. And fragmentation matters because markets rely on shared response more than shared opinion. When participants stop agreeing on how to act, even if they agree on the data, the system becomes fragile. The market hadn't broken, it had lost alignment. And once alignment fades, every future test becomes harder than the last. What followed will reveal how dangerous a market can become when agreement slips away without anyone officially noticing, and why rebuilding it takes far longer than losing it. As agreement thinned, the market kept moving forward, just without the harmony it once relied on. Prices still responded to news. Trades still cleared, but reactions no longer lined up. What had once felt synchronized now felt staggered, as if everyone was following a slightly different script. The conflict emerged when this misalignment began shaping outcomes. Small disturbances that once resolved quickly now lingered. One group stepped in early, another waited, and a third faded to move entirely. None of these actions were irrational, but together they prevented resolution. Agreement had been replaced by coexistence. Liquidity reflected the change immediately. Depth appeared uneven. Support showed up in pockets, not walls. Capital was willing to act, but only on its own terms. The market stopped feeling like a single system and started behaving like overlapping intentions. The tension deepened as this pattern repeated. Each session reinforced the same behavior. Moves traveled further before encountering resistance. Recoveries arrived later and felt less decisive. The absence of agreement didn't create chaos. It created drag. Everything took more effort. Institutional desks noticed a shift through execution. Trades required more timing. Slippage varied unpredictably. Strategies that depended on shared reaction struggled, not because they were flawed, but because the environment no longer rewarded coordination. Derivatives markets captured the discomfort quietly. Protection remained bid even when volatility stayed low. Skew reflected uncertainty about participation, not direction. Traders weren't worried about what would happen. They were worried about how others would respond. The buildup continued as agreement eroded further. Participants stopped assuming collective behavior. They planned for divergence. Position sizes shrank. Time horizons shortened. Optionality replaced conviction. These adjustments were sensible, but they reinforced fragmentation. Veteran participants recognized the danger clearly. Markets don't need disagreement to destabilize. They need lack of agreement on response. When alignment fades, liquidity loses initiative and price discovery slows. Small imbalances become harder to resolve. The market was still functioning, but it was functioning without cohesion. And cohesion is what allows markets to absorb uncertainty without magnifying it. The next phase will reveal what happens when a market without agreement is forced to make a choice, and why fragmentation, once established, makes every decision heavier than it should be. Because when agreement disappears quietly, it leaves behind a system that moves, but no longer moves together. The moment that required agreement arrived, without ceremony. A modest shock passed through the market, the kind that normally invites a unified response. This time, responses diverged instantly. Prices moved, then hesitated. Some participants bought the dip, expecting the old reflex. Others waited, unsure whether support would hold. A third group sold into the move, sensing the absence of coordination. Each action made sense in isolation. Together, they ensured the imbalance would not resolve quickly. The conflict intensified as fragmentation fed on itself. Early buyers found no reinforcement. Late buyers found worse prices. Sellers found more room than expected. The market wasn't volatile. It was disjointed. Agreement had been the mechanism that once synchronized reactions. Without it, timing became everything. Liquidity exposed the cost clearly. Depth appeared unevenly, flashing in and out. Support existed, but arrived in pieces. Capital no longer absorbed pressure as a group. It negotiated individually. The market stopped behaving like a system and started behaving like a collection of opinions. Institutional systems struggled with the new reality. Algorithms calibrated for a coordinated response produced conflicting signals. Risk controls triggered inconsistently. Execution became unpredictable. Not because the tools failed, but because the environment they were built for no longer existed. The buildup accelerated as correlations shifted unpredictably. Some assets moved together, others decoupled entirely. Diversification became unreliable. Without agreement on response, relationships between assets lost ability. The market's internal map began changing under pressure. Veteran participants recognized the danger immediately. Markets can survive disagreement. They cannot survive disconnection. When participants stop responding together, price discovery slows and imbalance lingers. Small shocks become structural stress. As sessions passed, familiar levels lost meaning. Support didn't break cleanly, it eroded. Resistance didn't reject price. It delayed it. Every move required more effort, more volume, more time. The absence of agreement had turned efficiency into friction. That was the realization. The market wasn't lacking information. It was lacking alignment. And alignment, once lost, is not restored by price alone. The final phase would reveal what happens when a fragmented market is forced to resolve uncertainty anyway, and why the outcome always feels harsher than expected when agreement is no longer there to soften it. Because markets don't move on opinion. They move on agreement. And agreement had quietly slipped away. Resolution arrived not through consensus, but through exhaustion. When agreement was gone, the market didn't suddenly find unity. It found direction by default. Price moved far enough, long enough, to force alignment where coordination had failed. That was the climax. Not a dramatic break, but a forced convergence. Participants who had waited were compelled to act. Those who acted early adjusted. Liquidity returned only after direction was undeniable. Agreement didn't lead the move, it followed it. What surprised many was how impersonal it felt. No single narrative explained the outcome. No decision-maker could be pointed to. The market resolved fragmentation the only way it could, by pushing price until disagreement became too costly to maintain. As volatility settled, the resolution became clear in behavior. Participants adapted to a new reality. Position sizes shrank. Strategies simplified. Coordination was replaced by caution. The market stabilized again, but it did so without the shared assumptions it once relied on. The deeper lesson lingered beneath every trade that followed. Agreement is not about optimism or sentiment. It's about shared timing, shared responsibility, shared response. When that alignment disappears, markets don't break immediately. They grind, they drift, they force resolution through movement instead of cooperation. Rebuilding agreement takes time because it requires trust. Trust that others will act when needed. Trust that response will arrive without being demanded. Once that trust erodes, price becomes the only language left. Understanding this reframes how market stress should be read. not as conflict, but as absence. Absence of coordination, absence of shared belief, absence of agreement. Because when agreement quietly disappears, the market doesn't warn you. It teaches you slowly, expensively, and without asking permission. So what do you think? Are markets still moving together right now? Or are they simply moving in the same direction for very different reasons? How